All right, so let's get right into it. Today, we're going to talk about this piece of vintage tech that's, well, it's the perfect example of a so crazy it just might work idea. We're talking about the Numitron tube, a product that had just one absolutely brilliant idea surrounded by a whole bunch of really, really bad ones.
And look, I'm not just being mean here. That's a direct quote from our source material on this one. The verdict is in. Right from the get-go, they were terrible. I mean, they were literally described as the crudest possible way to produce a technically functional 7-segment display. Ouch.
So that's the big question, right? If this thing was so awful, so janky, why on earth would a huge company like RCA even bother? Well, to figure that out, we've got to jump in the time machine and rewind the clock a bit.
All right, picture this. It's the late 1960s. The digital age is just kicking off. You know, computers are starting to shrink, and suddenly microprocessors are popping up in everything. Cash registers, lab equipment, you name it. And all of these new gadgets, they needed a way to show you numbers. This created a massive, massive demand for cheap and simple digital displays.
And the solution that was pretty clearly going to win out was the good old 7-segment display. It's a concept that's been around forever, since like 1910. It's so simple. You just light up different combinations of these 7 little lines, and boom, you can make any number from 0 to 9. It was simple, it was efficient, and it was super cheap to control with all the new digital logic chips coming out.
So, okay, the format was basically a done deal. Everyone agreed on 7 segments. But the technology to actually make those segments light up, oh, that was still a total free-for-all. And the main contenders, well, they had some pretty serious issues.
At the time, the whole scene was basically dominated by 2 big players, Nixie tubes and vacuum fluorescent displays, or VFDs for short. And yeah, they worked, but man, they both came with some serious baggage that designers just had to put up with.
Now, they looked totally different, but they both had the exact same core problem: voltage. Nixie tubes, I mean, they're beautiful, but they needed a whopping 180 volts to run. That's kind of dangerous. VSDs were a little better, but they still needed around 30 volts plus a whole separate power source just for a heater element. The bottom line was, no matter which you picked, powering the display was a huge, expensive headache.
And this is exactly where RCA saw their chance. While everyone else was fumbling around with high-voltage gas and complicated vacuum tubes, you can just imagine someone at RCA going, you know what, hold my drink. And they came up with an idea so simple, it was almost insulting. Their big idea? What if we just make a weird little light bulb? And this was its superpower. 5 volts. That's it. That was the entire sales pitch. Now, why does that one number matter so much? Well, because 5 volts was the standard operating voltage for all the logic chips that were going to be controlling the display anyway. And the absolute genius of this idea was just how ridiculously simple it was. You could hook a Numitron directly to a standard decoder chip. You could power it with the same 5-volt supply the rest of the circuit was already using. That means no extra power supplies, no special high-voltage circuits, and you didn't even need current-limiting resistors. In theory, this was going to save designers a ton of money and a ton of complexity. So the concept? Absolutely brilliant. The execution, though? Ooh, boy. Let's just say it was not. The final product can really only be described with words like janky or slapdash. Seriously, it felt less like a professional component from RCA and more like something you'd see in a high school science fair project.
I mean, the list of design sins here is just staggering. First off, the glowing filaments, they were so thin, they were barely legible. The layout itself was awful with these huge, ugly gaps between the segments. The whole number was infuriatingly off-center inside the glass tube. And to top it all off, for some reason they put it against a gray background, which just killed any contrast it might have had. It was a complete mess, from top to bottom.
And honestly, you get the feeling that nobody at RCA was all that proud of this thing. I mean, even the name was lazy. They just took Numi for numerical and tacked on Tron, which was basically the .ai buzzword of its day. It was the ultimate generic tech suffix you just threw on things to make them sound futuristic.
But here's the thing. The Numitron's biggest problem wasn't even its shoddy construction. Nope. Its biggest problem was that a far, far superior technology was already peeking over the horizon, ready to make it completely and utterly irrelevant, almost overnight.
And that technology, of course, was the light-emitting diode, the LED. In this comparison, it's not even a fair fight. The Numitron was a fragile glass tube that got hot. LEDs were rugged little blocks of epoxy. The Numitron had these thin, fuzzy, hard-to-read lines. LEDs had sharp, crisp,
perfectly defined segments. In every single category that actually mattered, the LED wasn't just better, it was a knockout winner.
You see, the Numitron had this tiny, tiny little window where it made any sense. When it launched in 1970, it was the cheap alternative because, well, LEDs were still insanely expensive. But technology moves fast, right? Within just a couple of years, LED prices absolutely plummeted, and factories started cranking out these rugged, super legible displays. By the late 70s, the Numitron was basically a museum piece.
So, what's the final verdict on this weird little piece of tech history? What can we learn from the short, kinda sad life of the Numitron?
I think ultimately, the lesson here is that a clever idea just isn't enough. Yeah, the product technically worked. It solved a real problem, for sure. But it was so poorly put together, so obviously crude, that it just screamed cheap. And it turns out, device makers would much rather pay a little extra for something that actually looks professional and polished.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? We're always told to find the simplest solution. But the Numitron is the perfect reminder that there's a really fine line between elegant simplicity and just being crude. So maybe, just maybe, sometimes the simplest solution is actually too simple.